Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this National Captive Nations Week Summit. This week, we continue the bipartisan tradition of standing in solidarity with all of those peoples around the world who were subjugated by communist regimes. This was begun in 1959 when Congress and President Eisenhower passed the National Captive Nations Week Act that declared the third week of July each year to be that time when Americans across the country would better understand and seek to support those peoples suffering under communism. Today, that work is as important as ever, since 1 out of 5 people alive on Earth today still live in a single-party communist dictatorship, especially in China. The Chinese Communist Party, since it came to power in 1949, has been responsible for more death and systematically abused more people than any other entity in human history. Nowhere is this more evident today than in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur people and other ethnic minorities are targeted and forced labor camps and re-education camps. Today, it is our pleasure to give our Human Rights Award to Ilham Tohti, a courageous champion of peace who has sought to bridge the cultural divide between the Uyghur people and Han Chinese. For this, he has been targeted and punished by the Chinese Communist Party. Here to accept the award on his behalf is his daughter, Jewher. We're also very pleased to have Senator Rubio, Congressman McGovern, and Assistant Secretary Destro joining us today. We'll also hear from representatives of the Tibetan people, the Uyghur people, the Mongolian people, and Hong Kong. I assure you that your voice matters, especially when enlisted in the service of those who have been silenced. Please join us this week to stand for those in China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, Venezuela, and Hong Kong, whose voices are being silenced.
Good morning and greetings. I thank the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and their supporters who are joining us this morning, and want to recognize in particular the bravery of our awardee, Ilham Tohti, recipient of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's Human Rights Award. Of course, he cannot be here in person to accept this well-deserved award, but he is certainly with us in spirit. The United States has always been a source of hope to people around the world, fighting to replace authoritarianism with liberty, justice, and the rule of law. We condemn oppressive regimes that deny people their unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've been especially vocal about the Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses, which rank among the worst in the world. You can rest assured that the United States will continue to speak out as the CCP carries out human rights abuses against religious and ethnic minorities in Tibet, Xinjiang, and elsewhere, as well as against lawyers, activists, and average citizens seeking to exercise their most basic and fundamental rights. We've recently seen credible reports that the CCP is not only engaging in mass detention, internment, and forced labor, but it's also now imposing coercive population controls in Xinjiang. These recent, credible, and deeply disturbing new reports have been revealed by the thorough research of Dr. Zenz. They're shocking, but they're sadly consistent with the CCP's decade-long callous disregard for the sanctity of human life. In Tibet, where the Communist Party's oppression goes back decades, there's also an ongoing campaign to eliminate Tibet's unique religious, linguistic, and cultural identity. Interference by Chinese authorities in the selection of religious leaders, government-controlled management of monasteries, the disappearance of the Pakan Lama, and other key figures, the so-called re-education of monks, nuns, and other scholars, threatens to erode the foundation of Tibetan religion and culture. The Chinese government's promises of bilingual education have also been broken. A new generation of Tibetans will soon struggle to communicate in their mother tongue, a skill critical to sustaining the Tibetan Buddhist faith and other Tibetan traditions and practices. Disturbingly and ironically, the CCP continues to claim a role in selecting the Dalai Lama's successor, even as Secretary Xi has urged party members to remain, and I quote, unyielding Marxist atheists. This claim violates the basic principle that Tibetan Buddhists, like every other faith community, should be able to select their own leaders without interference. The United States has taken the strongest actions of any nation in the world to protect the human rights of all people in China. The administration has applied visa restrictions on CCP officials and business leaders believed to be responsible for or complicit in the campaign of repression in Xinjiang and restricting access for foreigners to Tibet. We've applied financial sanctions on PRC senior officials and the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau. We've included a wide range of Chinese companies on the Department of Commerce's entity list for their complicity in human rights abuses, and we've issued a business advisory to caution and advise companies about the risks of supply chains. We call on the Chinese Communist Party to immediately end their horrific practices, and we ask all nations and civil society organizations to join us as we demand an end to these dehumanizing human rights abuses. I'm proud to stand up for victims of communism and human rights abuse, and I'm proud to stand with you today. Thank you for your time and for your attention.
Hello, this is Senator Marco Rubio, and I'm honored to join you via video during this year's Captive Nations Week Summit hosted by Victims of Communism. For generations, Americans have come together to advance the cause of freedom. I vividly remember my grandfather and aunts fleeing communism and repressive regimes in search of a better life. And sadly, we continue to see authoritarianism on the rise, and we find ourselves faced with new yet familiar challenges. Among the challenges that the U.S. and our fellow democracies face is the threat posed by the Communist Party of China. That is why this year's summit on the horrifying human rights situation in China is so important. The Chinese Communist Party is committing cultural genocide against the Tibetan people, crushing Hong Kong's long-cherished freedoms and autonomy, imprisoning human rights lawyers, and silencing those who dare to speak out against the party. The Chinese Communist Party is also engaged in a systematic campaign to wipe out the ethnic and cultural identities of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. The CCP has thrown more than 1 million Uyghurs in so-called re-education camps where they are forced to renounce their faith and pledge loyalty to the Communist Party. They're subjected to torture and to sexual assault as well. Evidence continues to emerge that Uyghurs and other minorities are being exported from Xinjiang to work in factories elsewhere in China. Western supply chains are being tainted by forced labor, and now, according to the New York Times, personal protective equipment such as face masks make us all complicit in their abuses. New research based on Chinese policy documents evidences Beijing suppressing Uyghur birth rates through forced contraception and sterilization across Xinjiang. These human rights abuses carried out by the CCP almost certainly are crimes against humanity, and we need a formal investigation into the crimes committed, including a determination of genocide. Last month, President Trump signed my Bipartisan Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020 into law, and also announced targeted sanctions against Chairman Xi Jinping's henchman, Chen Chuan-Gua, who is responsible for the evil policies inside of Xinjiang and previously in Tibet. The United States has taken steps to hold accountable those responsible for egregious human rights violations in Xinjiang, but more has to be done. So thank you all for all you do to shine a light on the abuses committed against those living under communist regimes. I applaud the courage of all Uyghur Americans who raise their voices at great personal risk, not only to them, but also to their loved ones. I also want to recognize Uyghur activist and scholar Ilham Tohti, who remains unjustly in prison for his work. I was honored to meet his brave daughter, Jewher, who will accept this award on his behalf today. To Uyghurs and oppressed people everywhere, let me say this: you are not alone, and your fight is the fight of every person who yearns for freedom. America and Americans will stand with you. God bless all of you and the work you do. and may God bless the United States of America.
Thank you for the opportunity to join the Captive Nations Week Summit to discuss the worsening human rights situation in China, including the persecution of Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups. It is gratifying that this prestigious human rights award is being awarded to Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti, who remains in prison in China, serving a life sentence in spite of his dedication to nonviolence and reconciliation. Chinese authorities have chosen to silence Uyghur intellectuals like Tohti, who embodies the peaceful struggle for peace and human rights in China. It is my understanding that Ilham Tohti's daughter, Jewher, is here to accept this award on his behalf. Thank you, Jewher, for your powerful advocacy, and please be assured that we stand with you and we will continue to do all we can to try to free your father. It is well documented that the situation for Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang is dire. We now estimate as many as 1.8 million people have been arbitrarily detained in mass internment camps and subjected to forced labor, torture, and political indoctrination. In addition, officials have increasingly sentenced individuals from ethnic minorities to lengthy prison terms for political reasons. The Holocaust Memorial Museum has determined that there is a reasonable basis to believe that the government of China is committing crimes against humanity. And there is new evidence that forced sterilizations and other coercive measures are being used to curtail family size among ethnic Uyghurs. Many more are now calling for an international criminal court investigation into whether genocide is occurring. In Congress, we passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that has led to Global Magnitsky Act and other sanctions on Chinese officials and entities complicit in these severe human rights abuses. But we have to do a lot more. This past year, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I chair, shined a spotlight on the use of Uyghur forced labor. We found that forced labor is widespread and systematic and exists both within and outside the mass internment camps, and that many American, international, and Chinese companies are complicit in the exploitation of forced labor. Now we are working to pass the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would prohibit imports from Xinjiang unless companies prove by clear and convincing evidence that their goods were not produced with forced labor. It is long past time for companies all over the world to reassess their operations and supply chains and find alternatives that do not exploit the labor and violate the human rights of the Uyghur people. The menace of authoritarianism is with us today, as it has been in the past. None of us should turn a blind eye to the wrongs occurring in China or any other country. I'm proud to stand in solidarity with the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and indeed all the people living in China in their struggle to live freely, practice their religious beliefs freely, and speak their own languages freely. Thank you again for convening this important summit and for your unceasing efforts to galvanize the U.S. and the international community to support the human rights of all people living in China. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for inviting the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, to participate in this important event. It is truly an honor to join you all. I know the evils of Chinese communism firsthand because I was born in a re-education camp during the height of the Cultural Revolution. In 1995, I came to the United States to attend college and was fortunate enough to receive political asylum. In 2003, I co-founded the Uyghur Human Rights Project. I have also served as president of the Uyghur American Association. I was honored when Speaker Nancy Pelosi appointed me to USCIRF in May of this year. We're here to celebrate the life and work of Ilham Tohti, one of the most important Uyghur intellectuals in recent history and a personal hero of mine. Tohti was an economics professor at Beijing's Minzu University, where he gained renown for his research on Uyghur-Han relations. He advocated for regional autonomy for Xinjiang, a region the Uyghur people refer to as East Turkestan, as a way to help repair relations between the Uyghur and Han peoples. Despite the fact that he advocated a peaceful solution for ethnic tensions, Chinese police raided his apartment, arrested him in January 2014. Later that year, a court sentenced him to life imprisonment for quote-unquote separatism. His trial lasted just 2 days. Last year, Ilham Tohti was received the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought from the European Parliament. These awards are significant. They recognize the importance of Ilham Tohti's work and brought greater awareness to the plight of the Uyghur Muslims. They also place Ilham Tohti squarely in the tradition of Eastern European intellectuals like Václav Havel and Andrei Sakharov, who pointed out the hypocrisy and broken promises of communism decades ago. Like the communist parties of Czechoslovakia and Russia, China's Communist Party does not stop at merely suppressing freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The party also insists on suppressing freedom of thought. In the Uyghur region, government has detained millions of Uyghur and other Muslims in concentration camps, where it has attempted to brainwash them into denouncing Islam and praising socialism. The Chinese government has focused on silencing Uyghur intellectuals because it knows that they are the people best equipped to speak truth to parties' lies. According to the Uyghur Human Rights Project, at least 435 professors, doctors, lawyers, and other intellectuals have been sent to the concentration camps. They represent generations of Uyghur knowledge that might never be recovered. China's propaganda outlets will sometime claim that the government's policies in Xinjiang have succeeded because the region is calm. To which I'm reminded of a Václav Havel quote. True enough, the country is calm. Calm as a morgue or a grave. The Uyghur people are too afraid to do anything but stay quiet. USERV has welcomed the US government's leadership in condemning and confronting China's persecution of Uyghur and other religious groups. We urge our allies and partners, especially members of the newly formed International Religious Freedom Alliance, to follow the US government's example by imposing targeted sanctions against the Chinese Communist Party officials responsible for these abuses. I think leaders of democratic societies around the world are coming to realize that a relationship with Communist China is not just about economics or security, but also about ideology. Xi Jinping ruthlessly punishes criticism of the Communist Party within China, and increasingly also retaliating against criticism of the Communist Party from outside China. It is only because of the bravery of Ilham Tohti and other intellectuals that the world knows the full scale of Communist Party's repression of religious freedom in China. Thank you.
In the context of the Captive Nations Summit, I have been given the privilege to present the Victims of Communism Human Rights Award to Ilham Tohti. Tohti is a Uyghur, an academic and member of a severely oppressed ethnic group in northwestern China. Tohti is a moderate, someone who sought to build bridges between the Han Chinese majority and his own ethnic group. He was rightfully concerned about the breakdown of trust between the Han and the Uyghurs, especially after the 2009 Urumqi uprising, and he advocated for policies of mutual understanding and cultural respect. Tohti realized that Beijing's increasing reliance on securitization, police state methods, and a colonial mindset to govern the region was failing to address underlying systemic issues of discrimination and discontent. The Chinese scholar Wang Lixiong once called Tohti a Uyghur Nelson Mandela. Tohti never challenged the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Even so, he was arrested in 2014 and charged with separatism, even though Tohti explicitly opposed separatism. He became the victim of Beijing's increasingly totalitarian approach to minority governance, an approach that culminated in a campaign of mass internment starting in 2017. This campaign which is ongoing, represents the probably largest incarceration of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. It is now my privilege to present this Human Rights Award to Ilham Tohti's daughter, Jewher Tohti. Unfortunately, I cannot give it to you in person, but one day I very much hope to meet you. And we are always thinking about your father and his situation and your situation. We really wish you all the strength that you need and all the strength that you deserve to advocate for this important cause of your people. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Jewher Ilham. I want to thank the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and all those who made it possible for my father to receive the Human Rights Award. My father understood he was at risk of being a victim of communism under China, but he also believed having open and free discussion was at the heart of solving the long-standing tension between Han and Uyghurs in China. With this award, you not only highlight my father's work and the persecution he has endured because of it, but you bring to the attention to the plight of over 1 million Uyghurs who have been forcibly detained in concentration camps in the Uyghur region. I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell my father's story, because he cannot tell it himself. To be honest with you, I don't know where my father is today. 2017 was the last time my family received word about him. At that time, he was being held in Urumqi First Prison. I have not seen my father since we were separated at the Beijing International Airport in 2013. We were on our way to Indiana University, where my father was invited as a visiting scholar. Unfortunately, he never made it to the US. On that day, we were pulled out of the security line. I was given the choice of boarding the plane and flying to the US or staying with my father. My father insisted that I continue. He said to me, "Don't cry. Don't let them think Uyghur girls are weak." I went, and because of his encouragement, I'm able to speak on his behalf even when China hopes he has been silenced. But during the time we were separated, while I traveled on, he was detained, beaten, and questioned. Now he carries a life sentence at some undisclosed location. I will never be able to return to China again. It is hard to believe that my father still physically resembles now the man I knew as a child. The man who worked at my bedroom desk in pajamas after I complained that he spent more time on his Uyghur Biz website than with me. When there was a problem, my father always had a solution. He believed that when there was a problem, you need to fix it. Just like when there's a hole in a fabric, you need to sew it. An unresolved problem, he thought, will lead to a bigger problem. And so, he moved his laptop into my room and he worked at my desk while I sat on my bed doing homework. This way, we could be together. Sometimes, he would forget how late it was, lost in his work until 4 a.m. in the morning. I would go in and out of sleep to the click of his fingers on the computer. My father was not afraid of devoting himself to the cause that came to define his life, fostering peaceful dialogue and understanding between the Han Chinese and the Uyghur living in the western part of China. For him, the problem was clear. Uyghurs were being denied basic rights: the right to believe what we believe, the right to worship the way we want to worship, the right to think what we want to think. For him, the solution was simple: to engage the Chinese government in conversation about working with Uyghur people in a peaceful, non-violent, and instructive way. But the Chinese government was not interested in conversation about addressing the tensions building in the Uyghur region with a Uyghur scholar like my father. a man who was committed to peaceful resolution. Instead, they labeled him a separatist and locked him in solitary confinement just because he dared to encourage people to work out their differences. Today, there's no freedom for Uyghurs in China, not at school, not in public, not even in private homes. Like my father, most Uyghurs have been labeled violent extremists with a disease that needs to be cured and minds that need to be washed. It is under this false label of extremism that the government has put over 1 million, probably more, into re-education or concentration camps, where Uyghurs are forced to give up their religion, language, culture, and families, where people are tortured and some have died. Extremism is the kind of language that the Chinese government uses to justify tearing families apart, controlling and monitoring every move of the Uyghurs inside and outside of China, and putting so many innocent people into camps. Even in my home in Washington, D.C., my phone and computer are often hacked. People ask me, am I scared? Yes, I am afraid. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat. Sometimes I worry that my speaking out will bring harm to my family living in China. Even this acceptance speech makes me nervous. I'm sure my father was afraid too. But when he identified a problem, he overcame his fear by working towards a solution, no matter the cost. So I ask you, whoever is listening, do you see a problem with the way the Chinese Communist Party is treating Uyghur people? If you see a problem, please work towards a solution. Work from your place of influence. I talk to you as one man's daughter, but there are hundreds of thousands of Uyghur sons and daughters who could share similar stories. To US officials, use your laws and policies to hold Chinese government and party officials accountable. To the NGOs, continue your advocacy and your research that help to expose these atrocities. For example, the work of Mr. Adrian Zenz of Victims of Communism, who was able to show the world the systematic program of sterilization taking place in the region. To journalists, never stop your pursuit of the truth and your fight for justice. To businesses, don't be complicit in using forced labor to produce products for the more than 80 name brand companies, such as Nike, who even refused to end the slavery of the Uyghur people in the name of cheap labor. To the academic community, please continue your research and support for academic freedom. People often ask me if my father would do what he did if he knew what the outcome would be. My answer is yes, I believe so. He was a man of principle, honesty, and conviction. He believed more in humanity than politics. While I don't know where my father is, I believe he is alive. And I know he would be honored to accept this award. Thank you.
Today, our world is threatened by sinister evil. The proof that the Chinese government is not interested in maintaining peace, but is rather pursuing complete eradication of dissent lies in the arrest and the life sentencing of Ilham Tohti by the Chinese Communist Party. As a prominent advocate for peace, he is admired not only by the Uyghurs, whom China is hell-bent on destroying, but he's also a role model for people around the globe. His award today is a reminder of this importance of his fight for justice and freedom. Ilham's legacy is inseparable from the destiny of our people in East Turkestan, and he and millions of others are not forgotten. Through the brave actions of Ilham's daughter, Jewher, who is the pride of our people, and all those who hold Ilham in highest regard, we will ensure that the unjust persecution he is enduring will not go unanswered. The Uyghurs' homeland has been occupied. A very mild way to phrase it. The land and its people have been completely brutalized under this fascist regime, now leading to genocide. Yes, genocide. In the beginning of the 1930s, countries around the world continued to do business with Germany, and they avoided acknowledging the burgeoning human rights abuses for the sake of economic trade, at the cost of millions of lives. Countries in Europe paid the price of economic cooperation with Nazi Germany, with bombs blowing up over their heads. The Allied countries easily defended their economic ties with Germany by hiding behind the claims of ignorance. Today, we have the information to act, but even after the painful chapters of history, we still find the international community is crippled by, and even they are being complicit in, the China's crimes against humanity. 3 million Uyghurs, including my own sister, are in the concentration camps, and the millions more forced to relocate and work as slaves for China's economic aggression. 13 tons of hair, perhaps, but a portion of what's being taken from prisoners seized recently, a byproduct of this genocide. How can this image not pierce our conscience? Is this the hair of my sister? Who is benefiting from my sister's forced labor? We know what this hair means, a very physical representation of never again happening again. There are crematoria attached to the camps now. What else needed for the world to wake up? Are we waiting for mass executions and the gas chambers to be broadcast to the world? How can anyone with a soul still remain silent? Do not make Uyghurs human collateral of this economic trade and the short-term politics. This is not just the calamity of the Uyghurs. It is a test for humanity. Chinese money has purchased the compliance of Islamic countries, of UN, of corporations, of NBA, the IOC, Hollywood, and the celebrities. But the world must take note. The history will remember the upstanders and condemn those who fail to stand for what's right in the face of this evil. Do not allow your conscience to be bought with blood money. Today, remember Ilham Tohti. He is an upstander. As we follow his example, may we prove that his efforts have not been in vain. We must act now, before the only voice left to speak is one of regret.
I'm very pleased to be speaking on this occasion of the Captive Nations Week event being organized by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation here in Washington, D.C. It's very fitting that you are honoring Ilham Tohti, a Uyghur scholar. When in 1959, Congress passed the Captive Nations Week legislation, Tibet was among those countries listed in it. Since then, while other countries listed in it, like Lithuania, Poland, or Hungary, have secured their freedom, Tibet continues to be a captive nation. The Tibetan culture is becoming a museum piece rather than the rich living culture it is. Tibetan environment is being endangered. The study of Tibetan language is being discouraged, and those who are calling for the study are being prosecuted. Tibetan religion, which is the soul of the Tibetan people, is being cynicized and controlled by the communist Chinese government, so much so that they want to select the next Dalai Lama. The Congress has been cognizant of these developments in Tibet and has taken a number of steps to address these challenges. Among these is the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, which calls on the United States government to encourage the resolution of the Tibetan issue through dialogue between the Chinese and representatives of the Dalai Lama. That act also called for the appointment of the U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues, whose task was to encourage this dialogue. Since 2002, there have been much development, and now today Congress has felt the need to update that legislation. So there is the legislation called the Tibetan Policy and Support Act before Congress currently. The House of Representatives has passed it, and the Senate is waiting to pass it. This Tibetan Policy and Support Act, among others, mandates that the United States take a position that only the current Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhist community can decide on the next Dalai Lama, and that Chinese government officials who attempt to interfere in the selection of the next Dalai Lama be prosecuted, and that Tibetan environment and water resources be protected as it affects the region as a whole, and that the United States open a consulate in Lhasa, and if the Chinese government doesn't allow us to do so, and no Chinese consulate should be allowed to be open in the United States. I take this opportunity to request all of you to urge your senators to support the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. There are restrictions in Tibet which are not present even in other parts of the People's Republic of China. I'm talking about, for example, the access to Tibet issue. While all Chinese citizens, whether officials, government leaders, or citizens, have the right, freedom to travel anywhere in the United States, American citizens, particularly Tibetan Americans, have to secure special permission if they want to visit Tibet. Congress wanted to address this challenge by passing the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act in 2018. And just early this month, in July, Secretary Pompeo reported to Congress as per this law, saying that he was imposing visa restrictions on Chinese officials who have been denying visas to Americans to visit Tibet. This is a very strong signal to China. Nevertheless, the Tibetan issue is yet to be resolved. The Dalai Lama and the Tibetan leadership in exile are wanting a solution through the middle way approach, and I hope that you, the international community, will help the Dalai Lama achieve his dream. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ilham Tohti. I'm the director of the Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center based in New York. I was born in Southern Mongolia, another captive nation of China like Tibet and East Turkestan. It is my great honor to join the Captive Nation Summit organized by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to honor Mr. Ilham Tohti and discuss the situation of Southern Mongolia. When the Uyghur activist Ilham Tohti was sentenced to life in prison in 2014 in the Chinese capital of Beijing, another activist and human rights defender, Mr. Hada, was transferred from a black jail in the suburban Hod, capital of Southern Mongolia, to an indefinite house arrest after serving 15 years imprisonment on charges of separatism and espionage, and 4 years extrajudicial detention without any charges. Mr. Hada, author of banned book We Out of Southern Mongolia, and the editor of a Mongolian journal, Voice of Southern Mongolia, advocated the genuine autonomy ultimate independence of Southern Mongolia and the merger with the independent country of Mongolia through peaceful means. In the early 1990s, Hatta, along with other Southern Mongolian intellectuals, established an organization called Southern Mongolian Democratic Alliance. On December 10, 1995, on the International Human Rights Day, the Chinese authorities arrested Hatta along with dozens of other members of SMDA. In 1996, Hatta and Mr. Tukshi, vice president of SMDA, were sentenced to 15 years and 10 years in prison, respectively, on charges of splitting the country and engaging in espionage. The SMDA was declared a separatist organization, and more than 70 other members were arrested and detained. Hatta's wife, Shina, has been frequently harassed and detained. In 2002, their 17-year-old son, Willis, was sentenced to 3 years in jail on trumped-up robbery charges. In December 2010, after serving his full sentence of 15 years, Hatta not only was denied the release, but also was transferred to another black jail, where he had to serve another 4 years extrajudicial detention. In the same time, wife Shina and Willis' son were arrested and detained for more than a year. In 2012, Shina was sentenced to 3 years in jail with 5 years reprieve on charges of engaging in illegal business, and Willis was placed under house arrest on trumped-up charges of drug possession. All 3 members of the family were held at the different jails and the detention centers at the same time for more than a year. Currently, Hatta is still held under house arrest in an apartment owned by the Chinese Public Security Bureau. He is denied the freedom of movement and communication with family members, relatives, and friends. Shina and Willis were also under the state security authorities' tight surveillance. Hatta's case is just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of other activists, writers, and ordinary herders who defended their rights to land, language, culture, identity, and way of life have been arrested, detained, and imprisoned. Since the annexation to China in 1949, Southern Mongolia has always been the testing ground of China's ethnic policies. China's first so-called nationality minority autonomy, which later was depoliticized and downgraded to ethnic minority regional autonomy, was tested and implemented in Southern Mongolia. Proven effective, this model was soon implemented in Tibet and East Turkestan. Under this titular autonomy, during the past 70 years, China has carried out a series of large-scale genocide, political repression, economic exploitation, cultural eradication, and environmental destruction in Southern Mongolia. Tens of thousands of Southern Mongolians were killed during the land reform movement, anti-national righteous political purge, and culture revolution. At least 100,000 Mongolians were killed, 500,000 persecuted in Southern Mongolia during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Shortly after the triumphant conclusion of physical genocide against the entire nation of Southern Mongolia, China started implementing another form of genocide starting early 2000, aiming at the total eradication of Mongolian culture, identity, and way of life. In the final phase of this cultural genocide, the Chinese government announced recently to implement the so-called bilingual education enhancement program starting this September to replace Mongolian with Chinese as language of instruction in elementary and middle schools across Southern Mongolia that offered Mongolian as language of instruction. This is the tragic fate of Southern Mongolia under the Chinese colonial occupation. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, I'm Wong. Thanks to the victim of communism for giving me this opportunity to speak here about the fight of the people of Hong Kong against the encroachment from Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party is a totalitarian regime, and so has long been aiming at absolute control over Hong Kong. But Hong Kongers are freedom-loving people, and we have been standing firm against the increasingly ruthless repression from Beijing. They first tried to intimidate us by arbitrary arrest. We stood firm and continued the fight. Then they deployed violence against us by policemen and gangsters, but we were not afraid and kept fighting. Lately, they unilaterally imposed the draconian national security law on Hong Kong, expecting to see Hong Kongers would be terrorized into giving up the fight. Some people even say that China will use the national security law to turn Hong Kong into another East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, where at least 1 million people are under detention in mass internment camps. The so-called crimes in the national security law are vague. One can be sentenced to life imprisonment for subversion, secession, terrorism, and collusion with foreigners. But the definition of this is left very inexplicit. The law gives power to the government to search private properties without a warrant issued by the court. Demand organizations provide information on suspects, freeze bank account, and prevents people from leaving the city. The national security law may be ambiguous, but the message behind it is not. Already a few dozen protesters have been arrested under this law. A 19-year-old was arrested for having a pro-democracy slogan sticker on his phone, and a 15-year-old girl was arrested for having a flag saying Hong Kong independence. After this arrest, some demonstrators went to shopping malls holding up blank white papers with no slogans or whatsoever. Still, they were also arrested by the police under this new law. People are afraid. Potentially dissident books have been withdrawn from public library, and school children prohibited from singing, chanting slogans, or boycotting classes. Cultural revolution-style book burnings have not yet physically occurred, but it may only be a matter of time. The new law has pronounced the death of one country, two systems. It is the end of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. It is a fundamental breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The future of Hong Kong is gloomy, and the cost of striving for what we deserve is rising. But it doesn't mean the fight is over. In contrast, I believe it could be the beginning of a victory if all the freedom-loving countries will go shoulder to shoulder to restrain the expansionist ambitions of the CCP. China's disregard of the Sino-British Joint Declaration has shown clearly that international treaties are merely blank papers to the CCP. The international community has already reacted strongly to the national security law, a reaction that the CCP may not have expected. The alliance of the free world is rising. We are increasingly seeing a change of a policy towards China, including from Canada, Australia, the UK, and the EU. And also, very importantly, the US has acted and taken steps to end Hong Kong's special status, terminating the territorial benefits with regard to US export control and technology, Moreover, the Financial Sanction Bill, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, will impose sanctions on Chinese banks involved in suppressing Hong Kong's freedoms and violating the city's autonomy. Hong Kong people are very thankful for all these actions taken by the US to hold China accountable. Across the Atlantic, the UK has reserved policy and abandoned using Huawei for 5G networks. It has also offered British national overseas passport holder from Hong Kong the opportunity to move to the UK, which they didn't have before. There are discussions in the German Foreign Affairs Committee and the Bundestag about national security and the use of Huawei 5G. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have suspended their extradition treaties with Hong Kong. The end of one country, two systems is a China reckoning. Finally, the free world has woken up and realized that China is a threat to the international order. China is a brutal and lawless regime. The battle between the free world and the CCP has begun. In our culture, we have a saying which precisely describes CCP's behavior. 欺善怕惡. The meaning is imposing upon those who are soft and fear those who are severe. The free world has been soft towards the CCP for decades, which has permitted China's expansionism and allowed it to repress Hong Kong. Now is the time for the free world to be severe and to defend our values and freedom. Thank you.
This week, we also welcomed President Trump's proclamation for this National Captive Nations Week. It highlighted the plight of Hong Kong, a population of 7 million people never before ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, but now are. The proclamation also recommitted America to the cause of freedom and reminded us that America matters, not only because of our interests, but because of our values. We stand in solidarity with free people everywhere and oppose tyranny. I encourage you to find resources about the struggle for freedom against communist tyranny today at our website, victimsofcommunism.org, for a world free from the false hope and brutality of communism. I'm Marion Smith.